Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how I did this portrait of Moose the Mastiff in pastels. So first off, once I put my glow background in, I always then start off with the eyes of the subject. My initial plan is to use my black Carbothello pencil just to map out the basic shape of the eye. I want to make sure that I've got that correct before I move on to any other part of the portrait. That's when I start to build up the iris colour, and then as you can see here, I start to build up the fur around it. Now, Mastiffs have a lot of change in tone within the face, and what I mean by that is the lights and the darks. The reason being, they do have some creases on their forehead, which is going to make the light shift in slightly different ways. You're going to have highlights and shadows that curve differently to other breeds. What this will also do is change the fur direction. So whether or not you've got a slight bump on the skin or one of these creases or wrinkles, or even if you've got part of the skull above the eye socket, for instance, that is sitting a little bit higher than something else on the face, that will cause a shift in fur direction. Now, fur direction is something that I talk a lot about in every single tutorial because it is really important. If we don't get that accurate, we do start to then change the shape of the animal's face, and then that portrait won't resemble as much like that pet as it should. So it's something that I think it's really important to study that reference photo really closely. After that, there are then the pencil length, so how long that fur stroke needs to be, and then how thick that pencil stroke needs to be. And those two things are going to vary massively depending on the fur texture that you're drawing. So for a Mastiff here, the fur is generally quite short, so I want to make sure that I have reduced the length of my pencil strokes. If I was working on this side of the face here between the eyes and I had the same length of pencil strokes as what you're going to see on the body, I'm going to make the hair here look really long, like it's a long-haired Mastiff, and that is obviously really not what I want. So I need to make sure that I'm adjusting my pencil strokes accordingly depending on the part of the animal that I'm working on. So although the fur direction, fur length and fur thickness are all very, very important, it's all also about how you build up those layers. So you'll notice that once I put my pan pastel base layer down, I don't then jump into my very lightest highlights. That's one of the biggest mistakes that can happen, but what then will occur is you won't have nowhere near as much depth built up with the fur. The fur will start to look very flat and more two-dimensional. So my biggest tip when you're trying to create realistic fur is to build up many subtle layers. Don't jump into those brightest highlights. The best way of thinking of it is if Moose was sat in front of you, or whatever animal it is that you're drawing, and you were to touch that animal, the fur that you touch first has to be left until the last layer. So you want to be working on the fur that's closest to the skin and building up from there. Now that is the case for 90% of the portraits. There are going to be an exception, there's not one rule for art. The one time where that wouldn't be the case is if I'm working with a particularly light coloured dog. So I've got a video here on YouTube of a yellow Labrador, and it was quite a pale yellow. I wanted to make sure that I got that in, so I didn't want to put in too much of a darker base layer. So if that is of interest and where I'm explaining the difference there between working from light to dark and dark to light, I will link that in the description below. One of my main aims for this portrait was to make sure that I didn't mud up my colours. Now this is one of the more common questions that I get asked, is how to avoid that happening. Now I do certainly find that Moose's colour is very similar to something like a Hungarian Vizsla, a Red Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and those colours are very easy to mix in with the blacks, and you can then end up creating that muddy layer. I've got many tutorials on Patreon, significantly slower, most of them are in real time, and I'm explaining how you can avoid mudding up of those colours. So if my in-depth slower tutorials in pastels and acrylics are of interest, I will link that in the description below as well. And when you're working on this coloration, it's about making sure you've got your values dark enough, but that they're not muddying up and reducing the vibrancy of these burnt sienna, browns and yellow ochre colours. So that's just something that I was very aware of from the very first base layer all the way to my final details. Now, there where I mentioned about the darker colours and the black, I don't want to then make my portrait too light. One of the biggest fears that we can have is we don't want to put our base layer down as dark as what's required in that reference photo, just in case we can't lighten it back up. Well, the main benefit of working with pastels on Pastelmat is that you've got plenty of tooth of that paper, so that if potentially you did go a little bit too dark, you can easily lighten it back up again. It's much better to do that than risk not going dark enough with your base layers, because there are two main things that are going to happen. One is your details won't show up, so you'll end up then starting to pick up some lighter coloured pencils just so that those details are more visible. But what then happens is it's a knock-on effect. So those lighter pencils will then create an overall lighter version and lighter colour of that animal that you're drawing. So again, the end portrait might not resemble as much like that reference photo as we would like. So that's one of my biggest tips for any portrait where you're trying to get a realistic look. Make sure that your base layers are dark enough. If your pencils are sort of struggling to show up, it's a good indication then that the base layers need to be a little bit darker, especially if you're confident that the pencil you're using is the right value. You know, it's light enough that should be showing up. So again, that's just one of the things that can really help there with judging your contrasts. Going back to the colour selection of whatever fur it is that we're drawing, the one thing that I have learnt throughout doing pet portraits is that you can be provided with 5 or 6 photos of the same animal, and that colour of that fur is going to vary from photo to photo, depending on so many different factors. You've got whether or not it was taken indoors or outdoors, whether or not it was artificial lighting, maybe the cat was sat near a window, or someone's used a flash. There are so many different things that impact that. So that's why I like to focus on my contrasts first, and then I focus on my colour. So I don't want to give the impression that colour selection isn't important, because it absolutely is. But I do know we put an awful lot of pressure on ourselves with that colour selection process. And that's why in my slower tutorials on Patreon, I really do focus on the colour selection. So I reference every single pencil that I'm using. And recently I've been uploading tutorials where I'm explaining what I'm doing whilst I'm drawing, so that then I can explain why I'm using that colour at that time. Why am I making it so that it is on top of that specific colour that I used previously? Because these are a combination of pencils that will give me the one colour that I'm going for. Very rarely is there a pencil out there that's the perfect colour for the fur that we can see in that photo. But what I also show in the Patreon versions is you can use different pencils regardless of the colour and still get something that looks close to that reference photo, because it's the contrast that I focused on. Let's say for instance I'm going with a burnt umber and I've got 2 different colours of that burnt umber. As long as they're the same value, so they're as dark or as light as each other, I'm still going to get a fur colouring that looks very similar because my contrasts are right. Whereas if you pick a burnt umber and it's a significantly lighter version of the burnt umber, it's going to be pushed up more towards the yellow ochre side of the colour wheel, and then your version might end up with a bit more of a yellower looking dog. So that's where the values play a really important role. So again, if colour selection and how I break that down into the way that I do my pet portraits is of interest, my Patreon is in the description. But if you've got any questions about that, then please pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help if I can. So going back to the fur texture, now that I've got more of Moose's chest drawn in, you can really start to see how the texture is varied from the face. I've significantly lengthened my pencil strokes to show that the fur here is a little thicker looking than the fur on the face. But what this section of the body is also highlighting is my contrasts. Now I know I keep speaking about the contrast, but it is because they're so important. Look at all the darker shadows, how they're curved over. That's really indicating at the structure of his chest. You know, he is a Mastiff. He's got a really strong muscular front around his shoulders. I want to make sure that I've captured that. The only way that I can do that is by making sure that I've got my lights and my darks in the right place, and that they are as dark as what's required and as light as what is needed. So it's something that really is going to either make or break that portrait. You can have the colour absolutely spot on and it might look like that reference photo, but if your contrasts are lacking, the whole portrait will just look flat. And also here, where I'm adding this voiceover separately and I'm now looking at this here on a computer screen, I can really appreciate how all of that change in fur direction is helping to build up his overall structure. And again, this is why I focus on this so much. Now I do have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. So if you would like to see that as well, I'll make sure that I put that in the description too. Now look at where the front legs are joining up to the shoulder blades, how it almost creates like a swirl pattern within the fur. This would be very easy to think that surely doesn't look right, but the biggest tip I can give anybody is just draw what you see. If you're finding that you keep moving the pencil in a slightly different way and it's altering the fur direction, but you're not quite sure why, turn your artwork upside down and your reference photo upside down and work on that one section that you're struggling with like that, because it will force your brain to see it for abstract shapes rather than the fur that you're actually drawing. When you've completed that area, turn everything back up the right way and you'll then be able to see that's exactly how it should look, but it is only because your brain has been forced to see it in a different way. So the last thing to go on Moose's portrait was his name and then his whiskers. I want to leave the whiskers till the last layer because they do overlap everything else. So here is a photograph of his finished portrait. I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared here are of use, and if you could give the video a thumbs up, that really does help to push it out to more people. And if you'd like to get notified of future content that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video at the weekend, but as I've mentioned, if you have got any questions, anything art related, pop them in the comments below and I'm more than happy to help. So as always, thank you so much for watching.